Good afternoon. I'm Prem Paul, Vice Chancellor for Research and Economic Development, and I welcome you and thank you for joining us today as we convene this Nebraska lecture, our second this year in the Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture Series. Usually, Chancellor Perlman attends this lecture, but a scheduling conflict precludes his attendance today. He sends his regrets and also his congratulations to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Ken Price. The Nebraska lectures are an interdisciplinary lecture series designed to foster communications among students and faculty in different academic areas and among citizens of Lincoln and Nebraska. We've been particularly pleased by the community response to these lectures. The Nebraska lectures are sponsored by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Research Council in cooperation with the Office of the Chancellor and the Office of Research. The Research Council, composed of faculty from across all disciplines at UNL, sports a number of competitive awards and programs designed to encourage and enhance research, creative and scholarly activities of all members of the UNL faculty. The Nebraska lectures are one such program. The Research Council chooses Nebraska lectures from UNL faculty on the basis of major recent accomplishments and the lecturer's ability to communicate this work to a multidisciplinary audience. I would also take this opportunity to recognize the sign language interpreters who will be helping us today. They are Kelly Brackenhoff and Nancy Burt. Please help me thank them for their fine work. After the Nebraska lecture, after Professor Price's talk, Professor Mark Walker, Chair of the Research Council and Professor of Mathematics, will moderate the question and answer session before we move to the reception in the Heritage Suite just across the hall. Typically, again, as I mentioned, Chancellor Perlman introduces our speaker, but today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Price. Ken joined our faculty in 2000. He is Hillegas University Professor of 19th Century Literature in the UNL Department of English and co-director of UNL's Center for Digital Research in the Humanities. Ken is, and by the way, this center is one of our centers of excellence. Not only Prem Paul says that, but everybody around the country and soon maybe around the world they'll start saying that, right, Ken? Okay. Ken is also co-editor of the Walt Whitman Archive, an internationally acclaimed online resource of Whitman's published works, photographs, reviews, and selected manuscripts. In addition to his academic scholarship and directorship duties, Ken graciously chairs the University of Nebraska Press Advisory Board. That press happens to be affiliated with our office. I'm especially grateful, Ken, for all your work. And of course, served on the search committee that recommended Donna Shear as new director of the press, and I'm doubly grateful, again, for all your work. And thank you for all the service that you provide to the entire university. Ken has built a distinguished reputation not only as a Whitman leading scholar, but also as a pioneer in digital scholarship. As today's lecture will demonstrate, those two topics are closely interconnected. Professor Price has described Whitman as the poet of democracy. That is, Whitman's influence is woven into the fabric of everything it means to be an American. Who we have been, who we are, and who we might be in the future. He is truly a cultural spokesman and icon. Whitman created an enormous body of work, plus he loved to tinker, to revise, edit, and change his work. Today, his revisions could be made by keystrokes, cut and paste, or hitting the delete key. But happily, Whitman used pen and paper, thus leaving a permanent record of his thinking. Even during his lifetime, mass media were changing. Whitman found creative ways to use newspapers, photography, magazines, and books to spread his ideas. Modern digital technology allows more access to Whitman's work and offers new tools for analyzing it. In today's lecture, Dr. Price will discuss how Whitman advanced print culture in his day and how his own 21st century efforts to digitally recreate Whitman's work have advanced our understanding of this important poet's work. The title of his lecture is I Passed So Poorly with Paper and Type, the Making and Remaking of Walter Whitman in a Digital Age. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ken Price.
Appreciate the kind introduction. I'd like to thank Chancellor Perlman, Vice Chancellor Paul, and the Research Council for asking me to give this talk. I'm honored, of course, to have a chance to speak in this series, and it's a pleasure to see so many students, colleagues, and friends here. I doubt very much that I'd be giving this lecture if it weren't for the extraordinary efforts and talent of a collaborative team we've built here at Nebraska. It's been a joy to be part of something bigger than any of us individually. Any praise directed at me, I take to be praise of the Whitman Archive staff and the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities. My talk today is a meditation on the impact of rapidly changing media on humanistic work. After some initial remarks situating Whitman, the first part considers the types of media change he confronted in his own time and frequently turned to advantage. The second part offers a brief account of the development of the Whitman Archive, with special attention to the issues at stake when a poet who wrote prolifically and revised incessantly is remade in digital form. The third part sketches our current work on Whitman and the Civil War as a means to open up larger questions, I hope, about the current state and future possibilities of humanistic research. Some of you may be asking yourself, so why Whitman? Why is it Whitman who was quoted at the entrance to the Cather Garden between Love Library and the Visitor Center, or in the Metro at Washington, D.C., or in a Frank Lloyd Wright building in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, as I discovered today on an unsolicited email sent to me? Why are so many of us here at Nebraska working on this particular writer? Each of us would answer that differently, but here's my explanation. Before Whitman, the United States was politically independent but culturally bound to British fashions and traditions. Whitman called for writers essentially different from the old poets and from the modern successions of jinglers and snivellers and fops. Many early readers were puzzled by his groundbreaking book of poetry, Leaves of Grass, but Henry David Thoreau warmed to the 1855 volume and praised Whitman as, quote, apparently the greatest Democrat the world has ever seen. A distinguished political theorist in our own day, George Kateb of Princeton University, concurs, quote, Whitman is a great philosopher of democracy. Indeed, he may be the greatest, in part because he writes the best sentences and phrases about democracy. Whitman imbued his art with the political vision of the founders, making freedom and equality the guiding principles that literally shaped the form and content of Leaves of Grass. Whitman's radical new work was based on experimenting with a voice that refused to discriminate and with a sprawling poetic line that opened itself to a teeming variety of experience while balancing the individual elements of that diversity. Not surprisingly, American culture has been in conversation with Whitman ever since, an ongoing dialogue about democracy, poetry, love, death, and the endless permutations of life that he believed would define America and eventually produce a republic equal to its ideals. Whitman's extraordinary cultural afterlife crosses art forms to shape fiction, music, architecture, painting, and dance. His words and his image are also prominent in popular culture, regularly appearing in films, television programs, popular music, and advertising, as well as in our political discourse. When he began his career, everyone knew that American literature was white, male, and New England-based. When he was done, long-held views about who might write and what the content of the writing might be had been challenged fundamentally. Whitman also speaks to us about issues of love and identity that have made of most profound importance to a great many people, nationally and internationally. He's been celebrated as the tenderest lover, and he's been revered and reviled as a poet of eroticism. He brought the body into American literature in a way that it hadn't been before. Recently, the poet Alicia Oestreicher explained what Whitman meant to her as a teenager growing up. Quote, "Like some improbably open-minded parent, he would permit everything." He permitted everything. That was the primary thing I noticed. The degree and quantity and variety of love in Whitman are simply astonishing. End quote. He's been a liberating force for men and women, gays and straights, blacks, whites, and other hues of humankind. Writing before words like gay and homosexual were in use, Whitman developed his own language of manly attachment, comradeship, and the calamus affection. On the eve of a war in which men would kill more than 600,000 of their fellow men, he was seeking ways to extend love between them. Whitman's candor about sexuality, of course, outraged 19th century reviewers. One called the book an explosion in the sewer. Another suggested that Whitman should be publicly whipped. Another urged him to commit suicide. When people react that strongly, you're probably onto something. Whitman wanted to pass from poet to reader, from one identity to another, from his time to later generations. And it is through an intimate voice that he reimagines the very act of reading, making it a bodily, at times even carnal experience. Camarado, this is no book. Who touches this, touches a man. Is it night? Are we here together alone? It is I you hold, and who holds you? I spring from the pages into your arms. And yet in other moods, Whitman was less confident about his ability to convey personal presence. In lines published in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, but later deleted, he declared, "This is unfinished business with me. How is it with you? I was chilled with the cold types and cylinder and wet paper between us. I pass so poorly with paper and types. I must pass with the contact of bodies and souls." Given his desire to have a book perform in such an extraordinary way, Whitman constantly strove to exploit and expand the capacity of print as a medium, even as he chafed against its limitations. The first edition of Leaves of Grass is as remarkable as any book in American literary history, and it broke with convention in innumerable ways. Whitman did not use a traditional publisher, and there's no evidence that he sought one. Distributed by a chronological firm, Fowler and Wells, the first Leaves was essentially self-published, and that offered room to experiment. He could try out an odd format with very large pages, allowing his expansive lines to spread with as few run-over lines as possible. He also experimented with cover design, illustrations, titling, and language itself. In producing the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he set some of the type, wrote advertising copy, designed the layout, chose the font, wrote the poems and preface, and published 3 anonymous reviews of the volume, including one beginning, "An American Bard at last." He did include some negative remarks in those reviews. Initially I thought because he wanted to sort of hide the fact that he was the author of them, but later evidence indicated he wanted to get caught writing these reviews, and so I think we can only conclude that he realized that bad publicity was every bit as good as good publicity. What was important was publicity, getting your name out, being known, being talked about. That was the essence of things. So Whitman can seem to be the most self-promoting of writers, yet paradoxically he included no author's name on the title page. "It was your book as much as it was his," he said. "For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you." Few readers wanted to own responsibility for the book, or to own it in a literal sense, for that matter. Of the 795 copies printed, about a dozen were purchased. The book struck its early readers as lawless. Few were convinced at the time that it was poetry. Even a rare admirer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, pronounced it to be the greatest contribution of wit and wisdom America had yet produced, but didn't call it poetry. It seemed to him instead a remarkable mixture of the Bhagavad Gita and the New York Herald. Emerson's remark captures the way Whitman managed to join the scriptural and the vernacular, the transcendent and the mundane. Many readers see in Leaves of Grass what Emerson described, something simultaneously magical and commonplace, sublime and prosaic. It was work produced by a poet who was both sage and huckster, who touched the gods with ink-smudged fingers and who was concerned as much with the sales and reviews of his book as with the state of the human soul. Much as our own lives have been marked by dramatic changes in information technologies, 19th century people also experienced profound changes in how information was captured, conveyed, and recorded. The development of the penny press in the 1830s, when Whitman himself was beginning a career as a printer and newspaper editor, dramatized the scope of a new democratic audience and raised questions that continue to be with us about the economics of distributing information. The penny press was the first to rely on advertising for income as well as subscribers, and so had to sensationalize coverage to attract a big audience and to compete for ads. Other developments were striking as well. The telegraph seemed to annihilate time and space, and photography reshaped conceptions of the self. Shortly before Whitman's death, new developments in sound recording allowed one to capture human speech in ways not previously thought possible. Thanks to this breakthrough, we can hear, more than a century after his death, what is apparently Whitman's own voice in a brief wax-cylinder recording. Despite changing technologies, the expanded reach of print culture, and Whitman's strong background in printing, the medium of print was at odds with one of Whitman's most basic traits. He was a compulsive reviser, and the fixed nature of analog material objects was in tension with his intellectual restlessness, his desire for an evolving expression of his ideas. Late in life, the poet thought about what all the photographs taken of him suggested about the wholeness of his life. It's hard to extract a man's real self, any man, from such a chaotic mass, from such historic debris. He himself literally lived among debris in a chaotic sea of papers. It was the way he chose to organize his life. In this photographic image, Whitman's writings appear as a mass existing on the border between order and chaos. Whitman himself is liminal, caught between life and death, both the source and product of the papers around him. The medium of the photograph highlights our own activity in the creation of Whitman. How can those of us working at the Whitman Archive, or anyone else, make sense of all that clutter anyway? Part of the difficulty in editing Whitman is that he produced multiple editions of Leaves of Grass and manuscript, notebook, and periodical versions. Previous scholarly editions, emerging out of the constraints of print culture, tended to produce just one version, most commonly the first or final version. Should the disorder be cropped out, as it has been in those earlier editorial treatments of Whitman? Should a more flattering depiction be constructed? Many have attempted to extract a version of Whitman in hopes of getting the real thing, the essence. We prefer to honor the debris in the belief that there may be more truth in the fullness of the entire chaotic record than in any distillation of it. In 1995, when I was at the College of William and Mary, I began work on what we then called the Walt Whitman Hypertext Archive with a graduate student, Charles Green, and it soon began to take off. Since then, the project has grown steadily to encompass a couple of dozen people at 5 institutions. It's a project that started small expanded to include a key collaborator, my co-editor, Ed Folsom, and has continued to expand further and further to include an extraordinary array of undergraduate and graduate students, librarians, archivists, technical experts, and so on. From the start, we've been clear about our purpose. The archive sets out to make Whitman's vast work, for the first time, easily and conveniently accessible to scholars, students, and general readers. This is no simple task because Whitman is the most challenging of all American authors in terms of the textual difficulties his work presents. He left behind an enormous amount of written material, and his major life work, Leaves of Grass, went through 6 very different editions, each of which was issued in a number of formats, creating a book that is probably best studied as numerous distinct creations rather than a single revised work. His many notebooks, manuscript fragments, prose essays, letters, and voluminous journalistic articles all offer key cultural and biographical context for his poetry. I'm not teaching this term, and I realize my voice is out of shape. Thus far, we have made available in non-profit, open access form all 6 American editions of Leaves of Grass and the 2 British editions published in Whitman's lifetime as well. We've also collected, annotated, and introduced for the first time over 160 Whitman poems appearing in 48 different periodicals from the late 1830s to 1892. We've recently begun work on translations of Leaves of Grass as well. The first Spanish translation of Whitman, done by Armando Vasur, was posted to the site in 2007 with an introduction and a literal back translation of Song of Myself into English so that readers with little or no knowledge of Spanish can gain some idea of how Whitman was first absorbed into the Hispanophone world. This work is highly illuminating with regard to the treatment of race and sexuality in particular. Other work on translation has recently been added or will appear soon. Several Russian translations are available, and German and Ukrainian versions are in progress. Discussions have also begun about work in Chinese and Portuguese. Our work on translation is spurred by our awareness that most people in the world read Whitman in a language other than English. Whitman has had an extensive impact on world literature and culture, and grappling with translations is one way to begin understanding how Whitman crosses borders and is remade as he is absorbed into other cultures, and often in surprising ways. The translations have served to position Whitman as a prophet of socialism, of democracy, of spiritualism, and of sexual revolution. Other features of the archive should also be highlighted. We've gathered over 130 photos of the poet and have provided an introduction and annotations for these images. We've compiled an annotated bibliography of every item of Whitman criticism from 1940 to the present, more than 8,500 records. This extraordinary resource will become more valuable as we both update it and extend it backwards in time to the very beginnings of Whitman criticism. We also present a collection of all known contemporary reviews of Whitman's writings. Work on the Whitman archive is planned through the year 2025. The timeline submitted with our NEH Challenge Grant proposal in 2005 remains a reliable guide to our efforts, though we are now somewhat ahead of schedule. This work reaches an audience of a different magnitude than any my training in the humanities prepared me to contemplate. Like most of my colleagues, I realize that I'll be lucky if a critical book I write sells 1,000 copies. In contrast, the Whitman Archive hosts over 200,000 unique visitors a year. They come from around the world and with every level of education. This diverse audience raises new questions about who scholarship serves and how it should be calibrated. Currently at the Walt Whitman Archive, we are focused on editing the Civil War writings of Whitman, probably the most important literary interpreter of this conflict. Support from the National Endowment for the Humanities will allow us to complete this work by 2011 in time for the observance of the sesquicentennial of the outbreak of the war. The war profoundly shaped Leaves of Grass, and Whitman extensively depicted and analyzed the Civil War in journals, notebooks, letters, essays, journalism, memoirs, and manuscript drafts. we're working to electronically edit, arrange, and publish, often for the first time, the hundreds of documents that give voice to Whitman's experience of the war. During a trip to the Library of Congress about 2 weeks ago, I uncovered an intriguing document that illustrates some of the issues, questions, and complications raised by the editing of Whitman's Civil War writings. This document, apparently never before transcribed or discussed, has been hiding in plain sight, as it were, in the middle of the world's largest collection of Whitman manuscripts, the Charles E. Feinberg collection at the Library of Congress. Even with a writer as thoroughly studied as Whitman, there are still gaps in knowledge and in the published record, as we're continually reminded in the course of our work. The document is a single artifact, but two different intellectual units, one on the recto and another unrelated one on the verso. That was typically Whitman's way of writing. Front and back of the pages tend not to be related to each other. It reads on one side, "The North, too, will eliminate, or rather has eliminated from itself, a hot, fierce, unreasoning squad of men and women with but a single idea. In this land of all the world, the land of all ideas, as welcome a release and elimination in its way as that of the South from its fire eaters." The second paragraph, pasted onto the page, reads, "The fact is, any theory of politics or statesmanship fit for the U.S. must be composite, tolerant, must be very large." This brief account is characteristic of Whitman in its striving for balance and inclusiveness and attempted even-handedness to North and South alike. Presumably the Northern, hot, fierce, unreasoning people were extreme abolitionists who threatened the Union, Whitman believed, as much as Southern fire eaters. There is in effect a purging imagined here, an elimination either controlled or out of control, will eliminate, or rather has eliminated from itself. Whitman is famously the poet of the body. His candor was not just about sex, but about other bodily functions as well. Possibly seeing soldiers die by the thousands of dysentery, the greatest killer in the war, may have turned his mind to this phrasing. It's worth dwelling on the word eliminate because Whitman used it in the variants elimination, eliminating so infrequently. He seems never to have used it in his poetry. Instead, the focus there is on what can be encompassed, absorbed, included. Whitman moves quickly from an image of purging to loftier thoughts of a theory of statesmanship, composite, tolerant, very large, with the final two words underlined in red for special emphasis. In addressing implicitly the key issue dividing North and South, racial slavery, he may have been hearkening back to a defining moment in his development as a writer. These famous early notebook lines, "I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul," he goes on. "I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the masters and the slaves, entering into both, so that both shall understand me alike." For Whitman to be sufficiently large, or to dilate, as he said elsewhere, so as to encompass even seemingly irreconcilable views, was a precondition for writing breakthrough poetry and for healing the nation, or at least attempting to do so. The incomplete verso of the document that I came across in the Library of Congress the other day might appear to be virtually blank, though you can see there's a little bit of writing just visible where the tear was, and it reads simply, "Was amputated. I cordially recommend him." Based on the generic distinctions we're using for the project, the recto is a prose manuscript, and this side is a fragment of correspondence. Whitman's recommendation of a soldier who had suffered injury and amputation during the war. These 6 words feel like a letter, somehow, and that feeling, based on such a tiny fragment, serves to remind us that we're making judgments all the time when we encode documents and declare them to be one thing rather than another. What is the essence of correspondence? Does it require salutation or a signature? Must it be mailed? Does a note to a printer on a proof sheet addressing that printer and signed by name or initial constitute a letter? And what about a lengthy inscription in the front of a book beginning, Dear Pete, and signed Walt? The overall physical artifact in the case at hand defies any single generic description, and as we transcribe and encode the document and position it as part of the larger project, other editorial questions will certainly arise. Further, the physicality of the document, an amputated document about an amputated soldier, serves as a poignant reminder of Whitman's personal, yet national and social record of the Civil War. In many ways, his experiences during the war reflect those of a diverse sampling of average Americans. He knew the war as it was so often experienced from the home front, through the wrecked and wounded bodies of its victims. The tens of thousands of soldiers to whom Whitman was an attentive visitor in the Washington, D.C. hospitals were Union and Confederate, black and white, soldiers whose lives were disrupted or ended by battle. He responded by doing whatever he could to ease the pain of those soldiers. According to Martin Murray, as a hospital visitor, Whitman quickly found that he was of greatest service when he performed the smallest of tasks, writing a letter home, feeding a sweet tooth, passing the time by playing a game of 20 questions. Whitman found the soldiers, many very young, desperate for an affection he was grateful to supply. In testimony before Congress in 1887, D. Willard Bliss, the chief surgeon of Armory Square Hospital, and that's just one of those huge ironies of life in the world, that the chief surgeon of the hospital that had the worst cases in the Civil War was named Bliss. The agony that he saw, the suffering that he saw, it's daunting and humbling. D. Willard Bliss, chief surgeon of Armory Square Hospital, where Whitman spent much of his time during the war, said, quote, "From my personal knowledge of Mr. Whitman's labors in Armory Square and other hospitals, I am of the opinion that no one person who assisted in the hospitals during the war accomplished so much good to the soldier and for the government as Mr. Whitman." The editing work for Whitman's Civil War writings breaks new ground for the Walt Whitman Archive in several ways, not least in its organization around a topic and time period rather than a genre. But the project is perhaps most innovative in the way we've begun to think about contextualization, a topic I'll focus on during the remainder of my time. The theoretical possibilities of digital scholarship oblige us to boldness. It's possible to see our current moment, when the boundaries of still nascent electronic scholarship remain movable, as an invitation to push those boundaries. One of the areas where we can rethink our work is in scholarly apparatus, annotations, introductions, and indeed all the various types of information we offer so as to provide enhanced intellectual access to the materials we present. Ideally, a digital thematic research collection like the Whitman Archive allows not only for the creation of electronic scholarly editions, such as the one I've been discussing, treating his Civil War writings, but also for the study of cultural context. If the nature of an edition is being profoundly reshaped by the digital turn, we can expect the accompanying commentary or contextualization to be just as profoundly re-envisioned and expanded. In print-based forms of editing, contextualizing commentary is nearly always relegated to a scholarly apparatus, introductions, textual histories, appendices, and so forth, that is subordinate to the text and is often miniaturized through various space-saving means. These methods were developed over hundreds of years of print scholarship for reasons both practical and intellectual. The realities of print have favored economy, both financially and in the presentation of information, but the reasoning that guided the development of scholarly apparatus for the page need not circumscribe our understanding of how such commentary will look, and more importantly, how it will function in digital space. The limits of print in the kind and amount of contextual material that can be provided need not obtain in the digital realm. Of course, being freed from the constraints of space further heightens challenges that we've always had about what to emphasize and how to make ourselves intelligible to audiences. One way to speak to these ideas is via collaborative work I've undertaken with Susan Lawrence, Kenneth Winkle, and others at the Center on a project entitled Civil War Washington Studies and Transformation. Oh, what happened here? Let's see. Lost a slide here. Huh. Well, skipped over a slide, but it doesn't matter. It was just a slide of the... There it is. Sorry. This project stands as an independent entity, but it can also be seen as a massive contextualization of Whitman's Civil War writings, a new digital form of annotation not directed toward glossing a crux, but toward glossing the totality of Whitman's writing from this pivotal period. If there's time, money, energy, and passion enough, this might be just the first of several such semi-autonomous time or place-based sites, perhaps one for each of the cities that shaped Whitman's life and work: New York, New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Civil War Washington examines the U.S. national capital from multiple perspectives as an important case study of social, political, cultural, and medical scientific transitions provoked or accelerated by the Civil War. The project draws on the methods of many fields: literary studies, history, geography, computer-aided mapping, to create an experimental digital resource. We think the site will ultimately provide insights into the large and complex forces that transformed Washington from a sleepy southern town to the symbolic center of the Union and nation. The identity of Washington was in many ways created by the war, and the developing city shaped how the divided country understood itself and the conflict. With the rest of the nation, Washington and its people responded in dramatic and distinctive ways to the 4 years of war. Washington became the most fortified city in the world, and its population tripled. Troops, fugitive slaves, bureaucrats, prostitutes, actors, authors, doctors, and laborers were among those drawn to the capital by a sense of duty, desperation, or adventure. Rapid construction permanently transformed the city. Military installations, government buildings, hospitals, transportation routes, and all of the other structures required by a national capital at war started to fill in the spaces so grandly laid out in L'Enfant's 1791 plan for a utopian metropolis. Surprisingly, little scholarship has focused on Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. Perhaps this is so because the forms of scholarship previously available could not adequately represent the complexity of the city during this period, its incredible change, the multiple perspectives, the interplay of literary, political, military, and social elements, and the sheer amount of uncollected information. Further, traditional forms of scholarship have been slow to deal with one of the most important aspects of Washington during the war: spatiality. Understanding the city's transformation requires the visualization of complex change. Such a visualization, linked with numerical data, images, and narrative accounts, is exactly what a digital platform can provide. We're gathering uncollected factual data about an urban space that served as the center both of the Union's war effort and of a divided nation, where hospitals arose overnight, wounded men moved in and out, contraband camps of fugitive slaves developed, and temporary shelters were erected to house the city's swelling population. Even as bridges were defended and a ring of forts was quickly constructed, Washington fostered vibrant life. For example, there was one theater in Washington at the start of the war. By war's end, there were 11 theaters. Who would have thought there would be that kind of development in the theater during wartime? The richly layered interactive maps at the heart of our project plot such geographic and temporal data regarding the transformation of Washington, D.C. The maps and underlying databases will make it possible to analyze change over time as structures grew and the population swelled and developed a new ethnic and racial mix. To develop further an understanding of the city, Civil War Washington will link to archived images and textual resources, including the works of Abraham Lincoln and Walt Whitman, as well as newspapers, congressional reports, military records, letters, and historical commentaries. Our work on Civil War Washington explores the lives of ordinary citizens through close work with census data, and it also considered famous individuals. With regard to the latter, Civil War Washington situates Lincoln and Whitman in the midst of this rich field of geospatial and temporal data. It makes possible multifaceted and dynamic studies of Lincoln and Whitman's activities during the war years based on textual and statistical evidence and using the power of maps and graphs to illustrate historical change. For example, when complete, the site will allow the plotting of Lincoln's and Whitman's routes on a daily and sometimes hourly basis. By providing a rich backdrop of census, health, and hospital records, theater schedules, horse car routes, and other factual data, we will make possible a better understanding of Lincoln's and Whitman's lives and their role in the transformation of the nation and its capital. Users will be able to customize the maps to display specific components of historical change and to analyze multifaceted spatial, temporal, and personal relationships as the war unfolded. As our data increases and we make connections with other online data sets and repositories, such as the National Park Service's The American Civil War, Forging a More Perfect Union, the Whitman Archive, and the papers of Abraham Lincoln, we anticipate that new arguments and findings about the Civil War will emerge. Bringing together these different fields provides opportunities to imagine the profound impact that physical and emotional suffering had on both obscure and influential individuals, soldiers, fugitive slaves, poets, presidents, abolitionists, artists, physicians, photographers, and on the character of a city and nation. As my colleague Ken Winkle has pointed out, our project therefore contributes to the emerging historical debate over the ethical and humanitarian character of the Civil War. A growing school of commentators, joined most recently by the historian Drew Gilpin Faust, the president of Harvard University, has begun approaching the social and cultural impact of the Civil War from the perspective of ethics and patriotism. Catalyzed in part by current controversies over how best to balance legitimate national interests against the lives and liberties of American citizens, this scholarly movement is re-examining the moral choices that a host of actors made, including supporters and critics of the war in both the Union and Confederacy, and how those choices reflected and revised prevailing cultural ideals during the 19th century. This research asks a fundamental question: how far should a nation go to secure its ideological interests and continued survival? Our project will advance and refine this compelling new intellectual approach. The Civil War not only represented the greatest challenge to national unity in the history of the United States, but it also helped to define and reinforce American and to a significant extent global conceptions of nationalism. This horrific war elevated individual and collective national devotion into a transcendent civic virtue, one that has been repeatedly challenged, refined, and reaffirmed ever since through a series of subsequent wars and national crises. By drawing upon the experiences of the capital and its people, Civil War Washington will illustrate the ways in which the war altered and took lives, challenged Americans' conceptions of patriotism, sacrifice, duty, and compassion, and overall stretched the tolerance of the nation's political, social, moral, and humanitarian fabric to unprecedented limits. Civil War Washington developed out of a conversation at the annual meeting of the Whitman Archive staff in 2005. At that time, some of the archive staff expressed concern that this kind of project could overwhelm the Whitman Archive. They wondered how Civil War Washington would fold into the literary project and worried about a potential diversion of scarce resources. One individual mentioned that having interactive maps of all Whitman locales would be great, though he felt that this should be a companion to the Whitman Archive rather than a freestanding project. Subsequently, however, as we've worked, I've come to a different conclusion. First, Civil War Washington has its own imperatives that are independent of the Whitman Archive. We would have created something different and more narrow if we developed a project called, say, Washington, D.C. as a context for Whitman's drum taps. Such a project, with all data collected and being sifted for its relevance to Whitman's work, would have had a direct but narrow usefulness. We are interested in creating, instead, something with a broader usefulness, something speaking to the interests of people in many fields, and perhaps though I know it's almost unimaginable, no interest whatsoever in Whitman. Ultimately, our approach may turn out to be the richest way to illuminate Whitman's Civil War writings anyway. Not only does a project like Civil War Washington provide an opportunity to think about how we analyze space and what role space plays in our understanding of and editing of textual objects, and therefore in our understanding of space and identity, it also prompts us to consider the spaces where text and context occur and how they are related. In digital space, text need not be separate from context. Rather than a separate apparatus, we can think about interaction and layering, where the boundaries between text and context begin to become porous. The Whitman Archive has thus far accomplished about half the work we set out to do. The Whitman Archive and Civil War Washington and the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities, more generally, are inherently experimental. We're going where scholars haven't gone before, and with truly innovative undertakings, there's always the possibility of failure of various kinds. That's what makes our work research and not production. There are a lot of things we haven't figured out yet, including a core matter, how to preserve the Whitman Archive. One thing seems clear: as institutions specializing in cultural preservation, libraries will play a key role in making our digital scholarship available to future generations. They have a long history of collecting and preserving stable objects, not dynamic, ever-changing works in progress, though. So we are doing all we can to work closely with libraries to create scholarship in ways that will make ingesting, as it is called, more manageable. With a keen awareness of how much time and money and effort has been expended on the Whitman Archive, we are more concerned than anyone that this work not be lost. You might well ask, why do you do this work if you can't even be certain it will be preserved? For me, the answer is simple. There is no more exciting intellectual place right now. We're in the midst of a huge change in how information is created, manipulated, analyzed, aggregated, stored, and preserved. We're on a bumpy but fascinating road, and we're getting to places worth visiting. We're also, by the way, working in the perfect medium for an author who is always revising and reordering and rethinking his poetry. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. So I'd like to open up for questions now. I have one request. If possible, it's best if you ask your questions at the microphone that's set up in the middle there. No one's brave enough to use the microphone. We can also repeat the questions if you'd rather not get up.
Perfect clarity.
Ken, could you talk just a little more about the discussion that you all had when you were talking about going from being focused on Whitman to this broader new project, and what sort of concerns that folks had?
I think it was concern about focus. Whoa, how'd that happen? Did I hit a button? Oh, you leaned into something. Okay, I thought I'd done something magical. We arranged for this drama ahead of time, and we would add to interest. Is there a toggle switch on that thing, or can you open a door and get more light? Maybe. Yeah, I'll try to answer the question and ask for your patience. I think focus and resources were the issues at hand. everyone only has so many hours in life and in one's day, and so the Whitman Archive is itself an overwhelmingly complex and time-consuming thing. So did it make sense to divert energy and potentially resources with the resource questions, since we have some funding from agencies to work specifically on the Whitman Archive, then we have to be careful to not misuse any funds, and any funds we did direct toward the project obviously needed to be funds not from resources that thought they were funding something else. Yeah, I think those were the key things. I thought of something else in the dark, but it's the whole excitement drove it out of my mind. If it comes back to me, I'll mention it.
I was just trying to save money.
Ken, excellent presentation, and also appreciated your humor. And I can relate to some of that paperwork. Don't like to really get rid of that. So that was very, very nice. My team members will appreciate that. The question I have is you really are in a territory that has not been traveled before. What sort of challenges you've had in getting acceptability in your field, and then what sort of technological challenges that you had to deal with?
Okay. Yeah, I actually thought about the rest of my answer to the other one, so maybe I'll begin there. I think actually there's a certain political challenge of negotiating the two projects. I mean, even in the description of the project today, I see Ken Winkle in the audience, and the last thing he would want to do is to think of the Civil War project as being a sort of footnote to the Whitman Archive, or as contextualization for his project. And the people that I work with who are entirely and only in the Whitman Archive side of things, they too might wonder about the proper relationship between the two. So figuring out how to work with those two groups, and the two groups have overlapping members, is one of the things that is relevant as we go forward. Prem asked me about the challenges I faced entering this field, and then also about the technical challenges. People entering this field, graduate students and untenured assistant professors, face and continue to face significant challenges of acceptance. It varies from institution to institution. Here at Nebraska, we have as welcoming a place as I know of in the U.S., and that's to the credit of a whole array of administrators who've been very enlightened and cooperative. But there are places where you do electronic scholarship and they won't count it at all. And some of the reasons for that is that there are underdeveloped peer review mechanisms for electronic scholarship. Why is that the case? Well, print has been around for hundreds of years, as you know, and the web has been around since the early 90s. So we've only had so much time to build in those all-important peer review mechanisms for scholarship. But if we don't allow our scholars to enter into this new and experimental, exciting domain, then as universities we're doing a disservice. We're not advancing knowledge. So somehow universities have to negotiate this terrain and figure out how to figure out unconventional sometimes means of evaluating people in the field, even if there hasn't been the ordinary peer review through, say, a university press peer reviewing system. There are other kinds of peer review for electronic scholarship. Some of it is through granting agencies. Some of it is through new organizations that are popping up. Some of it is through acceptance of a project in a digital center. There are a variety of ways to measure the importance and impact, hits and absorption into the critical and scholarly literature. So there are plenty of ways for the Academy to evaluate this work, and so I just think it's frankly a dishonest dodge for universities to try to wash their hands of digital scholarship as if this is beyond us to find ways to evaluate it. It's also asked humanists to evaluate collaborative work, and for some odd reason there have been some people in some departments, some places, who have acted as if it's just beyond the capacities of professor in an English department or a dean in a college of liberal arts or whatever to evaluate collaborative work coming out of an English department or a history department, even though they routinely do that in the sciences and in business and economics. All the work is collaborative, just about. So, again, we just have to, I think, be a little bit more realistic and face those questions head on and call people on them when they take unrealistic positions. As for my own timing and how I came into this, I feel blessed in that I began this somewhat experimental work at a time when I was already a full professor. I'd been promoted through the ranks. I wasn't one of those brave people who I admire, who took the risk, put themselves on the line, didn't know whether they were going to get tenure. I can't take any credit there. I was at a point where I could take risks, and my collaborator, as Folsom, was also a full professor. We didn't know if we'd ever get a merit pay increase again, but we just figured it just had to be done, so it was worth trying. Technological changes and challenges are, they're endless, and we could talk all afternoon. So, and people would find it a little tedious, I think, to delve into too many details there. But we do our best to build our work in adherence to international standards, which sounds reassuring, as if there is a standard you can write to and then you'll be good. But the standards have changed basically every year we've been in existence, and so you're going after these moving targets. Sorry about that. So that's one challenge, and then the hardware and software changes with incredible speed, and so staying up with that is it's like a full-time job too. I think the heart of it comes down to the long and distinguished history that libraries have of preserving stable things, inscribed rocks and paper objects made on good quality cloth and things like that. And the idea of capturing work in progress is tough. And then since capturing a web page is a complicated thing, because you could take a snapshot of what you're seeing on the page, but since that page, in the case of the Whitman archive, is dynamically generated, you're also asking people to get the so-called style sheets that are creating the look of the page, and so what's probably most what I think we can have reasonable confidence about preserving is the underlying data of a collection like the Whitman archive, but whether we can save the look and feel and the wrapping of it, and so much of our intellectual contribution is in that wrapping, that's tougher. We have, at Nebraska, we had a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I can never quite get the name of that straight. IMLS is the abbreviation of the agency, to study the ingestion of the Whitman archive into libraries at the University of Virginia, Brown University, Columbia, I think one or two others, and it was partially successful, but the libraries reported back significant challenges and difficulties in doing this. It helps me sleep at night to realize that everything from big business to the U.S. military to projects worldwide are using XML, and which is the sort of encoding language we use for the Whitman archive, and so that in the future, if other techniques evolve, anything will have to be backwardly compatible with XML. And so there's I think reasonably good chance that if you can make something that your generation and hopefully future generations find is valuable, that people will go to the effort to migrate it into future generations. Barbara.
One of the aspects of criticism is to provide focus, and of course what an archive tends to do is dissipate. Well, I'd like to hear a little bit from you about conversations you have among your team about what the archive's obligations are to provide focus for the visitors in the archive.
I've been asked to repeat the question, which I don't know if I could completely do, but it was fundamentally about focus and what conversations we've had within the Whitman archive about how to provide for some clarity to users, since an archive tends to dissipate focus. Our organization, sort of default organizational structure of the archive imposes an interpretation on the material. It can seem sort of neutral because our categories seem like they're fairly neutral, but it is one way to think about it, and there are other possible ways. You could choose chronology. You could be interested in material objects. You could organize things around bindings or paper types or ink types and lots of other things. For intelligibility's sake and focus sake, Barbara, I think we've just recognized the inevitable that we are people with one foot in print culture and one foot in electronic culture, and so we look back to a past where people are used to having material organized in the way print culture organized it, and so we rely heavily on those categories of print culture, and people are fairly used to navigating those kinds of categories. So when we can, we employ them or extend their usefulness. We've also pondered creating an introduction to the archive, or like a greatest hits version of the archive or something, or Whitman for the high school crowd, or the junior high, and there are these. I mean, I've had letters sent to me from fifth graders asking me to work out a debate between the fifth grader and the teacher on a poem, and so there are all levels of people using this material, but we've shied away so far. It's partly a matter of time, to get to things, though I'm not sure if we'd want to do it anyway. But it's hard to create a secondary level, third level. I don't know what even language to invoke that doesn't seem condescending. And so what seemed to us important, and I think that's one reason why we've had a pretty large national and international audience, is that we've tended to use without sacrificing rigor or anything, I think we've tended to use a straightforward language that's free of jargon and things like that. And so an educated, or interested high school student or junior high school student, or an international person not working in English as the first language, but with some knowledge of English, can gather what we're working with. But yeah, the vastness of what Whitman has left, and the sprawling, way that an archive can move outward does lead to some challenges, and so we have to think really hard about how to create the pathways to that material and make very clear signposts so that people can find what they want.
Ask a question from here then.
Sure.
I was really interested in the slide you had about if you use like other webmasters, like over daily view count, how many people have visited, and how much thought goes into marketing and promotion. It's a non-profit endeavor, but still, do you think about, do visit types of everything that's like copywriting where the Whitman archive would end up on a Google search for Walt Whitman or materials about Walt Whitman? And is there any effort put into how do you adopt the website for a class? I'm not sure, but do you reach out to American literature or American history professors to get that URL on a syllabus or on a Blackboard site? Is this far outside of your concern as a scholar?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear how others on the project would react to that question. I mean, it's an intriguing one. I'd say that we're so busy most of the time that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that, and that for some, I mean, I haven't checked recently. I'm not fixated on these kinds of questions. But when we checked a few years ago during a writing of a grant and just popped in Whitman and Walt Whitman into a Google search, we kept coming up number one on the hits, and so we seem to be where we need to be in terms of Google's rankings. I think early on in the project, there were, when we didn't have that much content up, people were talking about how the ranking systems, this may have even been before Google was around as a big player in the search engine business, but people were spending some time about figuring out, what it is in the header or what is it that they're keying on to make their rankings, and and then how are other sites manipulating that in somewhat dishonest ways sometimes. And so, it just seemed to us there was too much important work to do to spend a whole lot of time changing after that or charging after that. In terms of reaching out to other American literature scholars, this project had its first funding with a pedagogical effort funded through the U.S. Department of Education and the Fund for Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, FIPSE as it's called. And the pedagogical implications of the project are large. I think in retrospect we were going at things backwards, that it will be much easier to build teaching tools when more of the project is developed or at this stage than it was when we were trying to do that back in the 1990s, because then we had the vision for what the project should be, but the content wasn't there, and so people were trying to create satellite teaching materials that would go with archives that were grand in plan but not delivering in terms of having content developed. We haven't systematically gone about sort of recruiting people for teaching, but I know one teacher at Cal Poly taught an entire class based on the Whitman archive a year ago, and I imagine more are teaching with it all the time, but I haven't systematically followed it. It's an interesting thing to think about, though, and whether there's a missed opportunity there.
In the interest of having everyone a chance to enjoy the reception, I think we kind of cut off the questions. Let's all thank Ken again.
Thank you for coming.
Ken, you've probably seen the poster, but we framed only 2 copies. One that you can look at it every day, and one that I can look at every time I meet in the Alexander Building, the conference hall. You've seen the hall of Nebraska lecture speakers. So thank you very, very much, and wonderful, wonderful job, and appreciate all the great work you do.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.